the world and time zone you're joining. I'm Professor Ashish Verma, the host and the moderator for this another wonderful session as part of this webinar series on sustainable transport and livability. Before we invite the speaker, Professor Roger Wickerman, to start his presentation, I'll just take all of you through a little bit of introduction about this webinar series. And the organizers of this webinar series so that all of you get a context and understanding of the background and the history of this webinar series so far. Manisha, can you just confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, sir. Screen
Yeah.
is visible.
Yeah, thanks. So today's is the fourth webinar in this series, international webinar series, and our esteemed speaker today is Professor Roger Wickerman. Um, He's currently associated both with University of Kent as well as Imperial College London in UK. Of course, I'll introduce Professor Roger towards the end of my introduction slides. Um, so welcome all of you to this interesting session today. About this webinar series, the purpose is to foster knowledge exchange and propel the discourse on topics related to sustainable transport and livability. It's jointly organized by this committee, Special Interest Group F4 of WCTRS, the World Conference on Transport Research Society, and the journal Sustainable Transport and Livability, that we call in short as TSTL, which is published by Taylor and Francis in association with my research lab. Typically, we are maintaining a frequency of about 2 months for every webinar. So we are having one webinar every 2 months, and the potential speakers are eminent researchers like today, and also in past through invitation, and also in some occasions selected authors of the papers already published in the TSTL journal. Just to give the history, the first webinar we had was on 7th March, and it was delivered by Professor Nashiv Kumar. Was an interesting session from Imperial College London. The second webinar was on 2nd May and was delivered by Professor Ahmed Al Ganaidi from McGill University in Canada. And again, interesting presentation about 15-minute city. Subsequently, we had the third webinar on 27 June, and we had two presentations on that day. First one was by Professor Kazuki Nakamura from Meiji University in Nagoya, Japan, and he talked about quality of life and walkability. And the second presentation was from the presenters from Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, IIT Roorkee, Professor Pushpa Chaudhary and Mr. Akshay Gupta. And they talked about electric bus versus conventional buses in Kathmandu city, and how it enhances urban mobility and sustainability. Just to briefly talk about the organizers, the Special Interest Group F4 focuses on livability and sustainable transport, and it furthers our knowledge on many linkages between sustainable transport and livability. Um, it is chaired by myself and co-chaired by Professor Kazuki Nakamura. We currently have 26 members. Just for your reference, there's the list of our current committee members. If any one of you are interested to be part of this special interest group, please write to me with your interest. Also about this journal, Sustainable Transport and Livability. This is published with Taylor and Francis. It was launched last year in 7th November 2023. It's an open access journal fully, but currently offers full APC waiver for authors. So it's a good opportunity for authors to utilize to publish open access with full APC waiver. This is the esteemed editorial board of the journal, and as you can see, along with me, my associate editors, Professor Seem Kendra from Ministry of Bremen, Germany, and Professor Meng Li from Tsinghua University in China. And then we have an editorial board consisting of esteemed colleagues and members from all across the world. This journal essentially, tries to answer questions on linkages of sustainable transport to livability, like, for example, how sustainable transport interventions affect physical, mental, economic, and social well-being, how it makes society and individuals healthier and happier, how these affect quality of life, equity, social justice, safety, accessibility, which is something that we'll dwell today in Professor Rogers' talk, affordability and environmental quality, and even impact on disaster resiliency and similar questions. So, as I mentioned, the journal is currently offering full APC waiver. It's a good opportunity for authors. I also was to mention that we are also starting a new World Symposium series on the same title, Sustainable Transport and Livability. It will be called as WSSTL. We are just shortly going to announce and release the website and call for paper. The symposium will be held next year during 25th to 27th June 2025 at Institute of Science, Bangalore in India. And subsequently, it will rotate across the world once every 2 years. And this symposium will develop and bring together community of researchers and practitioners in mobility from across the world to share knowledge and evidences on making this planet more sustainable and livable. It will be organized jointly between the Special Interest Group SIG-F4 and the Department of Civil Engineering in Institute of Science, Bangalore, which is also celebrating its 75 years currently. And so this symposium would be one of the celebrations of the 75 years of the Department of Civil Engineering. Uh, Talking about today's speaker, Professor Roger Wickerman, I actually don't need to talk about him. He's extremely well-known, researcher and personality in the transportation research domain. I think the more I speak, and the less it is. But just to say a few words, he's emeritus professor of European economics at the University of Kent, where he has been the member of academic staff since 1977. He is also a visiting professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Imperial College London, where he is chair of the Transport Strategy Center. Uh, I mean, he has so many accolades that I cannot really, cover in the introduction. But just to mention that he was also awarded the Jules Dupuit Prize of the World Conference of Transport Research Society in 2016, and he was the former editor-in-chief of Transport Policy Elsevier, and I had a wonderful opportunity of working under his mentorship as one of the associate editors during his tenure, during which he was the editor-in-chief, and a lot of learnings that I had and mentorship that I had from him. So with this short introduction, I am, very happy to invite Professor Roger Wickerman to deliver his talk. Please, Roger, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay.
And just advice for the attendees in the meantime that the Q&A session will happen at the end. There is a tag, on the top of the Teams app, Q&A, where you can put your questions. Please avoid putting your questions in chat, because I will focus and take the questions from Q&A section. Yeah.
Hang on. I've got the wrong presentation up here, Ashish. So
no problem.
let me. Same problem we had before.
You can just select the whole screen. Yeah. And then
It's just giving me a template instead of the.
uh-huh.
Oh, hang on, browse my computer. This is where we got it from before. It's refusing point blank to give me the.
So what's happening? Maybe you can just unshare and then do it to the process again.
Hang on.
Yeah, take your time, no problem.
That's because it's been shared before. It doesn't.
Okay. Then
There we are. I think I've got it. Can you see that
okay.
now?
No. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. Yes, perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
Please
Sorry
go
about
ahead.
that. Sorry
No
about that.
problem. Please go.
As I explained to Ashish earlier, they keep changing the way the system works, and it worked in a different way from that I was expecting. So thank you very much, Ashish, for the invitation to do this and for the welcome this morning. And thanks for keeping your introduction mercifully short in terms of this. And it's quite clear that the theme I'm going to talk about is one that you've already been addressing in this webinar series. So I hope it's not too repetitive of things that happened before. I've put at the top of this first slide two papers that I've written before, and if you can actually see the dates on these, you will see that it's 50 years since I first published a paper on accessibility. And interestingly, that paper still gets cited regularly when people are talking about accessibility. So it must have had some importance in that. And I think that's a useful time to reflect on it. That actually derived out of my doctoral thesis. When I was looking at the way that the interest in accessibility that had come about in that time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as an aid to thinking about improving the modelling that we had of transport mobility. The second paper, which was published 25 years ago, so there's clearly a sort of recurrent theme in terms of this, is a paper written with two colleagues, Klaus Biekermann and Michael Wegener, trying to apply more advanced accessibility measures and relating that to regional economic development in Europe. But both of those papers are very much about thinking about the techniques that are involved in measuring accessibility and how they can go into transport modelling. And increasingly, of course, it's been recognised that accessibility depends on what it is you want to do with it. And accessibility is not so much just about a geographical concept of measuring the distance between places. It's about measuring the distance between people and the activities that they undertake. And there's increasing emphasis on that because of the needs of thinking about equity, both equity across people, across communities, and across generations is something that's increasingly important when we're thinking about how we evaluate investments in transport. Equity and investment appraisal, of course, has always run up against the problem that it depends on the values of time that we use, because time is the major measure of separation that transport is hoping to overcome. And of course, the increasing emphasis on speed in many things is an important element that's involved here. Why I think it's important that we go back and reflect on where we are on this development is because of these external shocks that we are facing. First of all, the long-term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we don't yet know if we're going to return to something that looks like the normal that existed prior to the pandemic, or whether there is going to be some convergence to a new sort of equilibrium situation. And I think it's probably still too early to know that, but it is clear that we need to think about the way that it affected the way that people perceived travel, fear of infection, fear of being in crowded spaces, and the consequences of that. And also, therefore, their desire to change residential location. I'm very lucky. I live in a semi-rural area on the edge of a great area of historic woodland in the UK, and so I've got very easy access out into the countryside. Most days now that I'm retired, I either cycle or walk through the woods locally, and that, of course, is a very great measure of the quality of life that you can get. But of course, not everybody is able to live in those sorts of circumstances, and so how people respond to that in terms of their residential location is important. But the other big external shock is, of course, that's related to climate change. And the relationship to climate change is particularly important as something that affects both modes choice and the infrastructure needs. And it has varying things which are both decentralizing and centralizing at the same time, which may run counter to some people's preferences. And so I think we need to examine that in more detail. So that longer term recalibration of mobility needs and housing needs, and therefore of location and the shape of cities and communities is important, which might mean that in terms of the traditional modeling, the need to redefine economic mass and the deterrence effect of space is something that is particularly important in this. So that's the sort of background that I'm coming from in this, trying to reflect on where we've been going in terms both of the development of thoughts about accessibility and how these recent shocks to that might change the way that we need to go forward. Let's think about those changing concepts. Not only because, as Ashish kindly mentioned, that I was awarded the Jules Dupuy Prize, I think there is a lot to be learnt by going right back almost to the start of what we can think of as modern transport economics. Jules Dupuy, of course, was not an economist. He was an engineer, a French engineer, mainly concerned with things like the construction of canals in France. Published his very important paper in 1844. From a modern perspective, the important thing about understanding Dupuy is that he works in a general equilibrium framework and not the partial equilibrium framework that we've tended to use for transport appraisal more recently. We're very much in that sort of Cambridge-Marshallian framework of partial equilibrium. Why Dupuy was important in terms of this was that he thought in terms of the fact that it wasn't about the transport cost itself. It was very much about the delivered price of goods. Improving transport would change the delivered price of goods, and that would also affect, therefore, where you source those goods. He was actually thinking in terms of the carrying very large, bulky items for construction on barges. And obviously, therefore, the weight was important, but also was the distance in terms of transporting those. So that is something that I think we need to bear in mind as we've come increasingly back to the view that we need a general equilibrium framework in which to think about the interaction of transport with the activities that people undertake, with their use of land for both housing and for the workplace and for the activities that they undertake. But the need for precision in modelling very much drove the development of more sophisticated measures of accessibility in the later part of the last century. The use of the gravity model, and that's where this idea that you need an economic mass of attraction at one point, and also a measure of deterrence through distance, and how we refined that was seen to be important. So the gravity model and the related entropy model were particularly important in terms of getting that precision in modeling that we need for that. But as recent revisions and thoughts about accessibility have, and I'm referring here, for example, to a paper by the Dutch researcher Gers, talks about the need for accessibility being able to be based on infrastructure, based on location, based on utility, and based on individuals or households' accessibility and mobility. And the sort of, I'm not quite sure how useful concept of motility, the combination of mobility and utility, can be brought into mind. And of course, we tend, when we start thinking about people in terms of this, that very much it's about income. We think in terms of income because income, we know, affects the value of time. And the value of time is very important in determining the value of infrastructure investment. But it's not just about income. There are big differences between gender. And that relates not just to questions of income, but also to aspects of caring. Some quite interesting work has been done in South America, in Chile, about the way that changes in caring responsibilities make a major difference to the way that people can respond to this. And this is about caring for children, caring for elderly people, caring for disabled people, and that affects the way that people can access the activities they need to do, both in terms of their daily accessibility and in terms of their long-term accessibility. And that's about accessibility, not just to, for example, shopping and personal services, banking and so on, but also to healthcare. And changes in the provision of those, so I'll come back to later, of course, also has impacts on the need for transport, as those have often become more concentrated and less available in the locations where people live. So the question that's then left is, well, can we build all of those into some form of standard appraisal methodology based loosely around cost-benefit analysis? We have a very advanced system of transport appraisal and transport appraisal guidance in the United Kingdom that has continued to evolve to reflect changes in our understanding of mobility and people's needs. But can we build all of these, if you like, equity-based concerns into the CBA itself? The danger with that is that it simply becomes a question of trying to find appropriate weights, and those will typically be income-related weights. Or should it be something that sits outside? And I think that's still an open question as to whether that's something that sits outside that influences our decision. The CBA is one of the things that goes into influencing decisions. These accessibility concerns are something else that can feed into that and be left to the judgment of policymakers. And we've also seen, of course, the way that values of travel time savings change. A useful review paper by Mario Beristan and Eliasson in this has referred to the way that values of travel time change, yes, by income, but they also vary by travel time. Saving 5 minutes in a 10-minute journey is rather different from saving 5 minutes in an 8-hour journey, and therefore trip length. It varies by mode, and it also varies by journey purpose. And so that as this balance of different trip purposes changes, something I'll come on to in a moment in terms of the balance between work and leisure travel in the post-COVID era makes a difference to the way that we value travel time savings, the way we use those values of travel time savings. Okay, let's think about the effect of COVID-19. And I think there are three broad areas here. One is about the change in working practices. One is about changes in the attitude to the use of public transport. And one is about the impact on residential location, the three things that I hinted at earlier. The move to working from home, although complete working from home is not now the norm, but increasingly it's been a move towards a 3 or maybe 4-day week. The recognition that there are benefits to individuals in allowing longer periods of recovery from work, the 3-day weekend matched with the 4-day week, or increasingly the fact that we see from transport statistics that travel on Mondays and Fridays is rather less than it is on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. And that is reflected in various things. So, for example, London Transport has recently made Friday all day an off-peak day, so that where there are peak fares that are available in the, particularly in the morning and evening peaks for travel on the London Underground, for example, that doesn't apply on a Friday because they've recognised that travel on a Friday has much less peakiness, and generally peakiness has gone throughout the week. So that flattening of the peak is seen to be particularly important in terms of this, as people have tried to not just change the days that they work, but maybe also the hours that they work, partly in order to avoid as much crowding as possible. But of course, it also relates to the extent to which we've moved towards more virtual meetings. The growth of the webinar, of course, is particularly important in this, the way that we can have meetings without needing to travel, although an increasing realization that there is a need for travel, and it's often associated with the value of the meeting. It's been recognized for some time that if you're doing business that involves a large sum of money, you would rather face the person face to face and look in, as it were, into the whites of their eyes to be able to see the extent to which you're prepared to do business with them. But that has led to changes in business travel. And it's also, I was talking just this week to members of our airport benchmarking group at Imperial. And one of the characteristics we've seen there is the fact that has been with the legacy carriers, airlines, a move towards increasing the share of premium class seats in planes. And that's a reflection not of increased business travel, because that has fallen, but of increased desirability of people on long haul flights to take extra comfort and possibly be further away from other people as well. And so that there are these sort of curious changes that are going on right the way across the world in terms of the way that people are using travel related to the change in working practice. I've already mentioned the changes in the attitude to use public transport about crowding. The perception is often different from the reality about the extent to which there is both airborne and touchborne transmission of infection on public transport. It is probably less, mainly because public transport operators invested so heavily in cleaning systems during the course of the pandemic that they are now probably safer places to be than many other places in the world. But it's not just about that and the fact that people during particularly the early stages of the pandemic thought they would be safer in their own cars rather than on public transport if they had that option. And that led to, of course, continual changes in congestion. More people use cars, increases congestion on urban streets, and that has a negative effect on public transport, particularly buses, for example, which get caught up in the congestion. And so there's a knock-on effect that comes back. That not only are public transport operators losing customers, losing passengers, they're also facing increased costs, and passengers perceive that the service is less efficient than it was. And that has led to this impact on public transport finances. And in some cases, the response to that was a variation in the level of service. Though the marginal savings by reducing frequency on metro services, for example, which have got a very high fixed cost, is relatively small. But that continues to mean that it's more difficult to push public transport as a reliable alternative service to the private car, and therefore meet the need to try and maintain public transport, and the effect that that obviously has on things like congestion, but also on the push to net zero that I'll come to shortly. And I've already suggested this leads to people wanting to move towards more rural locations. Certainly a very big push, big rises in house prices in places further away. If you're only going to travel to an office on 2 or 3 days a week, you feel that you can make longer journeys on those days rather than having to undertake the journey 5 days in a week, and that enables you to look for a property in a more low-rise, less crowded environment. And that, of course, has an effect on the prices and the need for development of housing and so on. But of course, those areas are more difficult to serve by public transport, and that has a tendency to reinforce inequalities in accessibility, particularly for those people already in those areas who depend heavily on public transport. The people moving into the area are not going to use public transport, but are going to use private transport. Let me just sort of reflect on this with a little look at some data, just as an example. First of all, looking at some data. This is data that we collect through the Transport Strategy Centre at Imperial from our members. We've got something like 45 metros worldwide and a substantial number of bus operators and suburban rail operators, and more recently a group of airports that have come into it. And what we can see from the left-hand diagram, which is looking at average membership ridership by region, and we've got 4 regions: Europe, the Asia Pacific region, which includes both Asia and Australia. We've got North America, and we've got Latin America. And what you can see from this very clearly is that Europe and Asia generally move back to somewhere close to 100% of pre-COVID ridership. In Asia, it's actually bigger than that, and that was largely because of the expansion of a number of metro systems over this period that actually led to a rise in the ridership. But broadly speaking, we're in the area where there has been almost complete return. Less in some cases, it's a bit less, for example, in the UK than it is in continental Europe. On the other hand, in the Americas, the rise has been much less, particularly in North America. It has taken much longer for a return, and generally that we're sitting at somewhere between 60 and 70% return, where clearly public transport is less embedded in the environment and in the layout of cities than it is in Europe or in Asia. And the right-hand diagrams, I've just taken the example of Europe and the Asia Pacific in terms of this, to show that generally metros have performed a little bit better than bus and suburban rail, but that, as I say, particularly in Asia, is due to the increase in the size of some of the metro systems that we have in our sample. The beauty of our sample is that although it is selective, the data is all internally consistent because it's all collected on exactly the same basis. And so in that sense, it is you can delve into it more deeply than you can with publicly available simple ridership. It's very detailed data indeed. The other interesting thing with this is that if we look at days of the week, what we saw is that generally, less so in Asia, has been the move towards the weekday growing back less strongly than the weekend. So in Europe and North America, the weekend travel has increased by public transport much more strongly than has the weekday travel. That is less true in the Asia situation. And just to look in somewhat more detail at what's been happening in the UK, I've put together here the series produced by the Department for Transport by all modes. You will see that again there has been a movement back to somewhere between 80 and 100% by most of the modes of transport across the UK. The interesting one in this is the cycling one, which peaks at nearly a doubling of cycling at the time that everybody else was not traveling at all, but that cycling has generally now, the series stops in 2023 because they changed the definitions of it, but broadly speaking, cycling has returned to only just above the level it was prior to the pandemic. So that huge surge in cycling, some people thought this was the eventual shift towards the use of active modes of transport has generally disappeared. As traffic has come back on the roads, the attraction of cycling has gone away quite considerably in that period. There is some data which is not included on this table in walking, which suggests that walking also increased, and there's similar sorts of levels to prior to the pandemic. So this big shift to active modes of travel has really not occurred to the extent that we might have expected. There are some interesting things in this. That if you look at the national rail picture, it's not quite as good, except when we include the new Elizabeth line in London, the Crossrail venture, which has been extraordinarily successful, and that has taken rail ridership back to above 100%. But if we take the Elizabeth line out, national rail is at about 90%. London Tube is round about 80% still, and buses somewhere in the same sort of area. And I just want to focus on the bus issue a little bit more, because what we've seen in the UK outside London is that bus services have really not been as effective as they have been in London. So that passenger journeys by local bus services in London grew during most of the 2010s, whereas they were flat or declining in the rest of the UK. And for those of you who know about the organisation of transport, buses in London are organised on a franchising system, whereas in the rest of the country they're on a deregulated commercial system, which has been much less effective, and that is now starting to change in the UK. But what is interesting in terms of this, the right-hand one, because all bus services have to be registered, we can see here an enormous fall, a halving almost, in the number of local bus service registrations that are in existence. The data is a bit funny because that rise in the middle of the period was due to a change in the definitions, which tended to result in a degree of double counting. But the best analysis is just to look at the data from the beginning of the period and the end of the period, and we can see that the reduction in bus services is quite remarkable over that period. And if you allow me just to indulge myself for a moment, this is where I live in the UK. Just outside the city of Canterbury. And what I did was I found a map of bus services by the local bus operator in 1966, and those that are provided by the local bus service operator in 2022. And what you can see from this is that although the major routes are still served in that period, all of the small villages that lie in between, what I've called the deserts on the right-hand map, have largely lost their regular bus service operated by the major regional bus operator in that period. And that's something that has been ongoing. Those services which are uneconomic have to be supported by a local authority through subsidies, and those subsidies have been cut as local authorities have faced financial pressures in that period. So if you live in a small village off a main road, then you will find it very difficult to use regular public transport, and you'll also find that your local post office is closed. There is no local banking service. There probably isn't a doctor or a pharmacist, and you would have to get access to one of the larger villages or major towns in order to access those. And that is a real impact on the accessibility of people who don't have access to their own private transport. Now, it's just a sort of little picture that illustrates the sorts of changes that have taken place. Let me change to net zero now. And here, I think there are two big issues in this. First of all, there is the cost of upgrading the fleet. And I'm thinking here both about individual car owners, but also upgrading the fleet of bus operators and rail operators to use more environmentally friendly sources, to move to hybrid and then to full electric or even to hydrogen vehicles. The purchase costs of those and the maintenance cost are much higher, and that has to be factored in, and that of course for individual citizens has an impact. Matching the charging infrastructure to demand is important. If you live in a self-contained house, you can have your own charging point. If you live in a high-rise block of apartments, then having your own charging point is much less likely. You're likely to need to rely on public charging. And in some countries, certainly in the United Kingdom, public charging facilities have lagged behind the growth in electric vehicles that has led now to a stalling that. But also subsidies, the loss of tax revenue and all sorts of things there is particularly important in terms of these effects. So that subsidies to electric vehicles and the loss of tax revenue where there has been a reduction in the regular revenue it's taken, and the loss of fuel tax revenue is something that has to be addressed by all governments. Talking to a friend of mine who has an electric car yesterday, and he said, I think I'm going to lose the benefit that I have of a much lower annual tax on the car, to which my reply was a good thing too, because your car still causes problems, environmental problems and congestion problems. And so we've got to rebalance that. But of course, on mobility, we've got the problem that you can only, if you're a bus operator, really introduce electric buses, which are expensive to buy and to operate, on routes that are where they're going to be used intensively. Increasingly, cities have tried to control the use of cars that have high emissions and other vehicles, trucks that have high emissions, by low emission zones. But low emission zones, the whole of London is now covered by an ultra low emission zone, where if you don't have a qualifying vehicle, you have to pay a daily charge in order to enter that. And that has been seen to be particularly pernicious towards individuals who have less access to the funds necessary to upgrade it. And that might mean that the need to consider whether you call them 15-minute or 20-minute neighborhoods as being particularly important in thinking about that move to areas that can be largely served by active travel. So sort of coming towards a sort of conclusion of this about how that affects appraisal. As I've said, there is a need for objective measurement and time savings, but that really we need to think about these in a general equilibrium framework. We've gone part of the way by including wider economic impacts through agglomeration and the effect that that has on productivity. And we need to do more on the dynamic impacts of that in terms of the relocation of businesses. Does that mean that we think that there are benefits to connecting cities rather than expanding existing cities? And we are less good at appraising interurban infrastructure and thinking about how the effect of that on the wider economy through connecting cities is important, as opposed to the way that we can think about what happens when we expand cities. And how we represent transport in these models. The trick of the iceberg costs of transport, where we go back to the idea that transport costs are simply a reduction in the value of products when you take them out of the factory gate and take them away, or that they affect the benefit from work that people get by having to make longer journeys, towards a better representation of a transport sector that involves production and competition within it. And the new brand of quantitative spatial models that some of my colleagues at Imperial are working on trying to operationalize, both in an urban and in an interurban concept, look to have certain promising features in terms of this. Planning for the new normal makes us ask the question of what will mobility look like in 60 years' time. And I think that that does require a lot of future gazing. And it's not just about mobility and the desire for mobility, but it's the desire for a quality of life that's important in terms of relating activities to residential location and so on. And that's particularly important. So let me just give you some concluding thoughts on this. I suggested accessibility has changed from a geographical concept to human access to activities, and that we need to think much more about that. And there's accentuation of that trend from the shocks that we've had over the last decade or so. And those changes are not uniform across the population, but tend to highlight existing imbalances. And that has consequences for modelling and the impact on welfare. But it also has implications for future transport policy and the governance of transport. How do we reflect the interests of all users and potential users in a situation where the planning cycle and the budgetary cycle is very different from each other in terms of this? And that leaves, as always, a considerable research agenda, continuing to update our understanding of accessibility and how it affects individuals and households, thinking about how we define economic mass. It's not just about employment, it's about what you can do there and the deterrence effect, and also the changing working practices and public sector financial constraints. So thank you very much for listening. I started with 2 articles from 50 and 25 years ago, and here's the article from today in the journal Sustainable Transport and Livability that you can look at to see a more reasoned working out of some of these arguments that I've been trying to address today. So I'll leave it there, Ashish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. I mean, as always, it's an excellent insight into this whole concept of accessibility, and you started from earliest of your publications on this concept 50 years before, and ending up and giving us a perspective of how this has changed, also with respect to how COVID has shaped it and is changing it, and also this whole focus on net zero going on further in future will probably shape this whole notion of accessibility and how do we rebalance and redefine it. Let's take questions. I would request the attendees to please type your question answers in the Q&A tab that you have on the top. And I will read out those questions. There are already few questions that I can see. Let me probably start. The easier one, I think one attendee is asking to suggest a book or two through which we can learn this topic on accessibility, so that they also get a historical perspective and how the research on accessibility has been. So, do you have any suggestions or recommendations?
Well, what I would suggest is go to the article in Sustainable Transport and Livability. There's a long list of references in that, and that will give you, I hope, a good starting point. And that goes right the way back to the early days, and includes some of the more recent work by various people who've looked at this. Particularly if you're looking for names, people like Susan Handy, for example, are particularly have got some particularly important ideas on the way we can develop this.
Yes, thanks. So, the attendees can actually see this paper is already there online on the
Yes.
Sustainable Transport and Livability website in the journal. Going to the next question, again from, I think, the same attendee. There is a semi-rural area existing currently dependent on public transport. High-income families move there. And because now they can work 2 to 3 days a week, also because of this work from home things and so on, they use private vehicles mostly or more. Does this create an equity issue or any other challenges?
Yes. I mean, as I suggested, I mean, I use my local area as an example, but I've got an even more pressing one very close to where I live, only about 400 meters from where I live. There is a proposal to take a very large rural area that's currently used for agriculture and turn it into supposedly a self-contained community that would be have housing because of the pressing need for more housing, but it would, apart from the environmental issues of biodiversity and removing good farmland, which has led to a local outcry. The real problem is the fact that it's more likely that the only way that it could be adequately served is by private transport, and that would extract passengers from the existing bus services in the area and make them less viable. As I suggested, in the area where I live, the buses that run on the major routes are reasonably reliable and reasonably regular in terms of frequency. But any reduction in that will mean that people will start saying, well, I'm not going to use the bus because it's less reliable. It only turns up every half hour rather than every 15 minutes. And therefore I will use the car. That puts pressure, particularly in a historic city, on the infrastructure. It leads local authorities to want to try and raise parking charges, and that causes an awful lot of local. So thinking in the whole about this, it's about how you plan for an entire area so you get a balanced transport system in that area. And since we don't really know what we're planning for, because we don't really know what the long-term impact of these changes is going to be, that makes it rather difficult. But there's a big conversation that has to be had in terms of how we get this balance right as we move forward.
Yes. There's the next question. How can machine learning algorithms improve the efficiency and accessibility of public transport systems to support post-pandemic mobility and achieve net zero emission targets? Any thoughts on that?
Yes. Being rather Luddite on these things, I'm not a great expert on machine learning, but my colleagues at Imperial are certainly using machine learning methods to try and refine their analysis of these situations. And certainly there does seem to be a considerable benefit in terms of doing this. I mean, I was hearing earlier this week the extent to which they're using machine learning to try and machine learning methods to try and analyze the sources of misconnections in hub airports.
Yeah. The next question is, how do we integrate the concept of resilience into these considerations of accessibility?
That's a good question. Um, uh, uh, Resilience in transport systems is clearly important, and it's important in parts of the world where you get not just the big shocks that I've talked about here, like pandemics and so on, but also the resilience to adverse weather conditions, which have been, as a result, seems of climate change, getting getting worse. And so that as we're planning future transport systems, we're not just thinking about the demand side, we've got to think about the supply side and make sure that they are sufficiently reliable that people will wish to rely on them. And we're seeing that increasingly. I mean, that problems in aviation are seen to be problematic in terms of the fact that high turbulence events and so on.
Yes. So the next question is, it's usually seen that low-income group owning, old conventional vehicles. So how the net zero policies being incorporated and being, increasingly focused, would impact these disadvantaged, low-income groups or regions, which are specifically affected due to transit desert, in the sense, deficiency of transit services.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for example, in the case of London, the introduction of the ultra low emission zone covering the entire area of London. For those familiar with London, it's in virtually the entire area within the M25 orbital motorway. That also involved a scrappage scheme whereby you could take your old vehicle, non-compliant vehicle, and get a scrap value for it to assist you in terms of upgrading your vehicle towards one that would be compliant, which is basically petrol vehicles that are newer than about 10 years old and diesel vehicles that are newer than about 6 or 7 years old. And so, I mean, it's a partial solution, but that is one way of using the revenue that comes from the charges in the low emission zone to encourage people to upgrade the fleet so they don't have to pay the charge. But it has become a major issue, a major political issue in the UK, this introduction of charged zones where people see it as an additional charge on the use of their private vehicle. And that is because it affects not just private use of vehicles, but it particularly seems to affect small businesses who need a private vehicle for carrying their materials around, a van or something, if you're a painter or a plumber or a carpenter.
So there's kind of another question from Professor Asim Kendra, and he saying, you mentioned that there has been a population shift towards rural areas during post-COVID. What does this mean for the next disruption and transport planning around the next disruption similar to COVID here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea that maybe in responding to the last crisis, we forget about the fact that the next crisis may be different. I mean, economists have always been accused of being very good at solving the previous crisis, but not so good at solving the crisis that exists at the moment. And I think that's fairly clear from that. So yes, and that's why I think we need to have a long, hard debate about the shape of our societies and the shape of our communities in the future. And that's something that involves buy-in by the people who are affected by it. And I think that's therefore important. And that's why I think this idea, which has been put forward by Professor Tony Venables, of the contrast between expanding cities and connecting cities, I think is a very, very important one, because it may well be that connecting smaller cities rather than expanding larger cities may carry greater benefits in that, which is why it's probably fairly short-sighted of the UK to have abandoned large parts of its high-speed rail network proposal. It's done on the grounds of trying to put money into local public transport, but it may be that the next stage that we need is much better integration of different cities because of the complementarity of cities, rather than seeing cities as just being competing with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next question is, this is from a trendy Bhagya M. How to factor in the inclusive design for diverse user groups? I think she comes with the urban design background, especially persons with disability to improve the accessibility.
Yeah. And that's a whole sort of separate issue in a way. There's quite a debate that's been going on about the extent to which you should provide separate or integrated facilities. Many disabled groups have pushed back against the idea that you provide separate facilities that are specifically geared to their need. Low access, not only low access buses, but buses with lifts for wheelchairs and so on to get on, and separate them from the rest of the community. What, as I understand it, is the argument is that most of these people would prefer to be integrated into society, and I think that means that we have got a long way to go in terms of access. We had a wonderful, not wonderful, but terrible case of this just this last week, where one of our most famous Paralympians heading to Paris missed the train that she was scheduled on, got on the next train, but when she arrived at her destination in London, there was nobody there to assist her to get off the train. And so that the lack of integration in terms of that a person in a wheelchair can just turn up to a train and go ahead and get on with support. And that support is something that I think we do have to build in. And of course, that's interesting because, I mean, that's a clear case. So if someone turns up in a wheelchair, they will need assistance in most cases to get onto public transport, unless we can retrofit all our trains and stations such that there is level access. But not all disabilities are visible. And so that getting access for people who do not have that sort of physical disability is also important.
That's important. Yeah. So the next question is about, countries, North America, where you mentioned through your data that they had lower level of getting back to normal, post-COVID, versus countries where there was higher level of achievement of getting back to normal. So what do you see could be possible reasons for these kind of differences, especially with respect to culture and human behavior?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both behavior and the fact that North American cities on the whole were not designed to be served by public transport. And so that public transport, in a sense, has been retrofitted to some extent into it. And a good example of this is Washington, D.C., where the metro system was relatively late in being developed. The response to the pandemic was largely to reduce the level of service on the metro to try and save money. And that, of course, is counterproductive in terms of maintaining the service. I mean, there are also some technical problems with the Washington Metro as well. But it's also, of course, the case that you're in a city that was very much designed with streets that are designed for the car. That is interesting. It's different in some of the older East Coast systems. New York, Boston, for example, are a bit different from that. But generally over the US, you see that the response to the pandemic and falling ridership was to reduce levels of service. And getting that back again You lose regular riders, getting them back again is very, very difficult. So I think it's a mixture of both the response and the way that the preference for people is to go back to the private car. And I think it's going to take them a long time to claw it back from that position.
Yeah. So the next question is from attendee Samuel. The question is, what can we do to improve the accessibility of persons with disabilities in a very busy urban center like Lagos, Nigeria, or central London?
Yeah, well, I mean, I refer back to the comments that I made earlier. I mean, in old transport systems, retrofitting, for example, stations. I mean, if you look at London, the London Underground map includes symbols that show the stations that can be accessed by persons in wheelchairs, for example. But that very often only involves access from the street to the platform. It doesn't necessarily involve easy access onto the train itself because of problems of differences in platform heights and so on. And that's the sort of problem. Most of the buses, most if not all of buses in London are now low floor, and that therefore and with slightly raised sidewalk areas, it is possible, if you get good parking of the bus, for people to make it onto it. But then you get road parking by other vehicles. That means the bus can't access the stop ideally for the disabled person, causes a problem. And there is a limit to the number of people in wheelchairs, for example, you can carry on any one vehicle because there isn't sufficient space for them. And then you get conflicts between people in wheelchairs and mothers pushing buggies with babies in them. Who has priority in those circumstances? So I think it takes, you know, we've got the vehicles now that you can get that. We don't necessarily have the match between the vehicles and the infrastructure, but we've also got to think about the way that we make that sort of provision. And it's going to takes a long time. But what is very, very important is to ensure that you have a dialogue with the people who have got of the whole variety of disabilities to ensure that their views are taken into account in the future planning.
And what do you think about this concept of 15-minute city, especially to address the accessibility needs of disadvantaged groups or issues of urban sprawl?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the 15-minute city is one that is very important in terms of thinking about the provision of everyday amenities for individuals. The danger is that it's often been badly presented, particularly by politicians. And I'm thinking particularly of the UK in terms of this, so that people have seen this as being, I mean, in extremis, saying that politicians are trying to confine people into an area and not allow them to escape from it. That you need to pay a fine to move outside the area. And so that's a problem, I think, in the selling of the concept of that. I think the idea of having communities that do have all of the basic services within reach without the need to use motorized transport for the majority of people is a very good thing. But it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done again. It's about consultation, and it's about not trying to put ideas onto people without fully explaining what it is that you're doing. And I think we've been very, very bad at that in the past.
It's been world across the same story. So there's a clarification on, what do you mean by objective measurement, need for objective measurement. Somebody wants more clarity on it.
Yeah. the danger is the further we go down this road of saying that accessibility is more personal and not a purely sort of geographical zone-based concept. The danger is that we get into areas of subjectivity, so that when it comes back to it, we've got to be able ultimately to relate it to things that we can actually measure. And so it does have to relate to whose income, whose time is it taken, whose access to what sort of facilities. And that complicates the modeling, but it does mean that we've got to be awfully careful that we don't just sort of cherry pick ideas to take subjective views of what's important. It may well be that we feel that there is a need, if you like, for positive discrimination in terms of the way that we weight activities. But that is also, we've got to be awfully careful about how we derive parameters to enable to weight different people against each other. There have been attempts to try and do this in some places, to try and build in a system that provides a sort of equity basis to accessibility in order to try and select between priorities in terms of the development of urban public transport systems. That was done in Tel Aviv, for example, and that's, I think, something that we need to think about. But again, I mean, work is ongoing on these things, and it's ongoing, and sharing information internationally is very important in terms of this.
And now I know we are running out of time, and there's still a lot of questions. I'm sure that the participants can always write to you, but I'll just take two more questions, including one from me. So there's another question from from the participants. How do we reconcile the conflicting goals of equitable accessibility and efficiency in transport investment decisions? What factors will influence this reconciliation?
Yeah, I don't think they need to be put as quite such opposing things in terms of that. That I think if we can solve a degree of the equity problem, it actually helps the efficiency problem. If we can make sure that we have got better access for more people to more public transport, that means that public transport can, at least in terms of a financial sense, become more efficient in those terms. But it also comes back to the planning system again, that when we're planning for an efficient public transport, we've got to take these equity considerations into account to make sure that they are fully represented. Otherwise, you'll have a system that is neither efficient nor equitable. And so that it's about that integration, I think, that's important.
Yeah. So, a question from me. So, you might have heard about this TomTom index, traffic congestion index that kinds of, rates cities on traffic congestion.
Yes.
Our research lab has also been trying to, do a critique and critical review of that, and what does it really leading the cities to. I would also like to know your thoughts about it, especially since they focus and rank cities primarily based on travel time, or speeds. Is it a very narrow vision that's outdated? Because if you look at, for example, London is rated as among the most traffic congested cities using this kind of scale and measurement. Does that really reflect a true picture of what a city should be? So your take on this kind of TomTom index?
I think it's an interesting index because it helps you focus on one aspect of it. But we've always got to be careful about ranking anything or anybody on the basis of a single index.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real issue in terms of this. But it's also a reflection of the fact that you must expect that old cities, and London is, ultimately when it comes down to it, a very old city with a street plan that has existed over a very, very long time. To retrofit efficiency into the infrastructure of that city is very complicated. And so it's got to be based on a mixture of yes, capacity provision, but also restriction of demand to enable people to see the value of their journey against the cost that it's going to take. And that, of course, is unpopular. So that whether it's peak hour fares or whether it's congestion charging or whether it's low emission zones and so on, we're charging, that's a range of activities. And those have got to be planned carefully to try and make sure that you don't destroy the ultimate efficiency. And this is not about necessarily the efficiency of the public transport system. It's about the efficiency of the city to be able to achieve the level of productivity that you would expect from a city of a given size, because that makes the city richer. And if the city is richer, it can afford to do these things. And that brings us back to the general equilibrium framework again.
I know. I mean, I was also, shouldn't the concept of accessibility or the more, holistic measure of accessibility probably should be a better way of assessing a city's, sustainable mobility. Or my feeling is that the Storm Index essentially is pushing cities in a rat race towards a typical American cities, which are, highway and car driven, the way they measure and rank the cities.
But that's why you've got to take it in conjunction with a range of other indicators as well.
Yeah. That's great. So, the questions can go on. You can understand, Roger, when you are speaking, there's so much of interest, and I think we had wonderful participation today. And I could see, attendees from all across the world joining today. This was a extremely enlightening session. For attendees, please do look at the full paper in case you are interested to read more about what Roger presented today. And just to remind that, of course, another 2 months, we'll again come back with the 5th webinar with another very esteemed, speaker from somewhere across the world. And also, please look out for the announcement and call for paper for the World Symposium that we'll have next year in June on sustainable transport and livability. And I look forward for a wonderful participation in that symposium as well. So thanks again, Roger, for taking time and sparing valuable time with us on this wonderful webinar. And we hope to keep learning from your wisdom always and in future as well. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, Ashish. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope people have found it useful.
Yes. And of course, the recording of this session would be made available to all the registered delegates in due course in next few days. With that, we end the session, and thanks again to you, Roger. Thank you. And thanks to all the attendees.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care, Roger. Yeah, bye.